The Mack Center for Art and Architecture, Los Angeles, founded in 1994, is a contemporary, experimental, multidisciplinary center for art and architecture, and is headquartered in 3 architectural works by the Austrian-American architect R.M. Schindler. So this site, the Mackey Apartments, where we have an artist in residency program, our West Hollywood headquarters in the home where R.M. Schindler designed for himself and lived and worked, and also the Fitzpatrick Leland House up Laurel Canyon, another Schindler site. So this talk today and this kind of activation of this exhibition is made possible by the Department of Cultural Affairs, which we're super grateful for. So thank you all for coming, and I'm going to introduce Seymour Politan, my coworker and friend, who has put this together, and we'll get started.
Hi everybody, thank you so much for coming out. My name is Seymour Politan. I'm the Exhibitions and Programs Manager here at the Mack Center, and I organize this exhibition, which is upstairs, and it's Kati Hoffer and Preserve Bottle Village Committee, which we're very excited. I'm thrilled to be here today to introduce our 2 guest speakers, Rosa Lowinger and Daniel Paul. Rosa Lowinger is a Cuban-born American art and architectural conservator and writer. She founded RLA Conservation, a practice with offices in Los Angeles and Miami. Rosa is a fellow of the American Institute for Conservation, the Association for Preservation Technology, and American Academy in Rome, where she conducted research on the history of vandalism to public art and public space. Her books include Tropicana Nights, The Life and Times of the Legendary Cuban Nightclub, the recently published Dwell, a memoir of art, exile, and repair. She will be the keynote speaker at the 2024 DACOMOMO U.S. Conference to be held in Miami. Daniel Paul began historic preservation volunteer work at Grandma Prisbrey's Bottle Village 30 years ago, just 1 week after the 1994 Northridge earthquake. During his 15 years on site, he coordinated with the noted rebuilding team, state offices, and the Federal Emergency Management Agency for damage repairs. He authored public-facing materials and in 1996 wrote the National Register of Historic Places landmark application that helped protect Bottle Village. Daniel holds a master's degree in art history from the California State University, Northridge. His master's thesis presented the origin story of 1970s era late modern glass skin office park architecture. Maybe to begin, if you could just speak a little bit about your work and your history. Daniel, maybe if you could talk a little bit about your history with Bottle Village, and Rosa about your experience working with conservation in architectural and artist sites.
Okay. Well, my name is Daniel Paul, as they mentioned, and I started volunteer work at Grandma Prisbrey's Bottle Village in January of 1994. I remember this quite well because I went to an art museum in Newport Beach, Newport Harbor Art Museum, with a friend. I was an undergrad at Cal State Fullerton. I was 21, and I didn't realize that museums were closed on Mondays, or I forgot or something, you know. So I'm in the bookstore, and there was a hardcover magazine from Japan called Art Random, and it was all about folk art environments, and I fell in love with it. Suddenly, there was something about the fact that an individual who had no training in art and did not consider themselves artists in the traditional sense were devoting their lives, were devoting decades to making something to the creative process. And I found that so interesting. So the only place besides Watts Towers, which I knew about, that was in the book, was Bottle Village. I called a week after the earthquake, not connecting the earthquake to it at all, and I said, I want to check this out. And they said, we're closed from the earthquake. And I said, I'm a TA, I want to give a lecture on it. I'm just going there to take some slides. Is that okay? A lot of that was lies. To get onto Bottle Village, I did what I had to do. But the moment I got there, I knew I was in love with it, even though it was very, very damaged from the Northridge earthquake. So at this time, the earthquake had just happened. Everything was in piles. The damage was extensive. There were dolls, broken bottles, pencils all over the place. And I proceeded to stay there helping out with some of the things that Seymour mentioned for the following 15 years. So, and for me, it sort of served as a foray into what I do now for a living. I'm a federally qualified architectural historian. I do a lot of historic preservation work, and it was a good opportunity to sharpen my teeth, and that's where I did it.
So I was born in Havana, Cuba, and grew up in Miami, Florida. I came to Southern California in 1988. That's when I moved to Southern California. I lived in the Northeast, I went to school up there, and I became an art conservator. I studied at NYU at the Institute of Fine Arts and became a materials conservator working in museums and private collections. And I came out to LA to work at LACMA. I had a fellowship at LACMA, and I worked in the conservation department when we were first doing the Anderson wing, which is now gone, for the Zumthor building that's coming up soon. But anyway, and this was an incredible moment in history. This was the 1980s, like 1985 actually was when I first had the fellowship. We moved here permanently in 88. But that was a moment when we were first coming to terms in our field with the concept that contemporary art conservation was going to require a different set of skills than, say, working on traditional bronzes and marble pieces and whatnot. And it was a whole new world. You had to contend with an array of materials that were never intended to be used in art making, materials many of which had no track record in their longevity. You also had to contend with the artists, the living artist and their viewpoint, which was something that was becoming very important. The idea that the artist's opinion about what would be done with their work was vital to consider. We're kind of slightly on the other side of that, which I could talk about later, but that was a moment. And so I stayed in LA, we lived in LA, and one of the first projects, I eventually went into private practice, and I've been in private practice since about 1990, more or less. And one of the first projects I worked on was the Watts Towers. I was hired to be one of the Watts Tower team. I was the first professionally trained conservator on that project. And because of the Watts Towers, I got invited in 1992 after the fall of the Soviet Union, when Cuba was just starting to open up to the idea of US visitors. People had gone before through different channels, but the idea that Cuba was actively attracting visitors from the US, and especially Cuban Americans, was not at all something that had happened prior to the early 90s. And I got invited to present a lecture at a preservation conference, and they said, what do you want to lecture on? And I said, the Watts Towers. And I went to Havana and talked about the Watts Towers. And that's just a link to this conversation that we're having. But what I do is I work on, I'm a materials conservator. I work on sculpture, contemporary art, and architectural materials. It's easier to talk about what I don't work on. I don't work on paintings on canvas. I don't work on works on paper and books and textiles, but there's a wide range of materials, in particular that intersection between sculpture and buildings. So Bottle Village is a perfect example. Watts Towers, architectural materials. So I've worked on lots of Millard Sheets mosaics and mosaics in general, and the mosaic on the Academy Museum building, our firm worked on as well. And when you work at that scale, you're not always doing the hands-on work yourself, but we also work on the scale of working with your hands as well. And then the last thing I want to say is around the early 2000s, I started to write also about my work and write about other things as well. And so I've written a few books that are not specifically about conservation. I wrote a book about the Tropicana nightclub in Havana, Cuba. If anyone's been there, you will know the building I'm talking about. Because it wasn't only just this venue for performance, it's this extraordinary modernist building. And I wrote a recent memoir that came out last year that is about conservation and my family.
And then I read it. It's very good.
Thank
so
you.
I
Please
did a
read
little, did a little homework before I came. Didn't want to come unprepared. So
Yeah, amazing. Thank you so much. I think maybe an interesting next place to go is to focus in. So the title for this discussion today is called Conservation Piece, and it refers to a work that's upstairs, which I hope everybody will check out the exhibition if you haven't seen it already, called Conservation Piece by Kati Hoffer, Preserve Bottle Village Committee, and RLA Conservation. And one of the interesting things about this exhibition is that Grandma Prisbrey made these pencil assemblage works, and two of the works are upstairs, and they're being conserved throughout the duration of the exhibition. Rosa and her team are coming to the gallery during closed hours and conserving these works on site, but they're also presented in an exhibition context. So both of you kind of have different relationships or kind of different histories with the pencil assemblage works. I've heard you, Daniel, talk about when you first got there and experiencing the pencil assemblage works, and Rosa, a more recent direct engagement with it. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about kind of focusing in on these pieces that come from this larger environment and how it represents both as a singular object, but also as part of a larger body of work.
sure. So I'll give you a little, for those of you who may not know the context, I'll give you a little bit of context about Grandma Prisbrey's penchant for collecting pencils. She had a very interesting life. She was the last of 7 kids, born in 1896. From some of the biographies I've read on her, she was not kind of just a surprise baby to her parents. They had already taken the family portraits, and there she was. So, you know, she got married to a man who was 52 when she was 15. So kind of a May-December situation or more. I don't know.
I think it's more like January.
Huh?
I would call that more like
January, December. Yes, exactly. Before the present, BP and December. So she had 7 kids with him. Six of the kids died. She outlived 6 of them. There's a lot of psychology. There's a lot of stuff written that's sort of quasi-psychological or theoretical about why Bottle Village happened, and I could go into that later or one-on-one with anybody who wants to know. I've read it. So the pencils, she moved around a lot with the kids that she still had. She moved along the upper Midwest. She was born in Minnesota, moved to North Dakota, apparently got involved in politics. And Jeff Wack, who's in the audience, you may be able to, he knew Grandma Prisbrey. He was her assistant in the 70s, and maybe at some point you could talk what you know about her political thing. I don't know much about it, but she collected pencils because this was the way her mind worked. She had a certain efficiency to her thinking and a certain economy. For her, a pencil was free, and it was small and portable. So there was a certain rationale. She started building with bottles because bottles were affordable and readily available. There was a logic to this around economy or space. So she moved along the upper Midwest, then came down to Washington, worked at Boeing, came down to Simi Valley, which is about 40 or 50 miles northwest of LA in Ventura County, and she had all these pencils. The numbers range, I've heard, anywhere from 2,000 to 17,000, but there are probably thousands. And she took her pencils, and as a way to display them, she made pencil collages as a way to display her pencil collection. And the collages are quite delightful. A couple of them are up there. When the earthquake happened, my own personal connection with the pencils is when the earthquake happened, we were told to, and I think this is good conservation practice, to not move anything. Like the money's coming, don't move anything, just leave it there. It's easier to know where everything came from if you just leave it there. We might get into the money situation later, but that's a long story. It did not come right away. So for a while, some of these pencils were left outside, and once we started picking up the damage a couple of years later, when we realized the FEMA money wasn't coming, we found even more pencil collages. And then it was like, okay, we got to get these. Everything was triage. We have to get these into a safe space. And we were able to, rescue a lot of them. There were pencil collages under rubble that I didn't even know existed, because remember, I got there a week after the quake. I'm very thankful that you're involved in saving a couple, and that Kati cares enough to involve the preservation of some of the pencil collages into her exhibit, and that the MAC supports that.
So we were brought in to collaborate with Kati on this exhibit, and I remember that when we first started talking to you guys, it took me just a while to understand what this was about. I was like trying to understand it. And now that we've actually been doing it, it makes perfect sense how we're part of this process. We're like one leg of that stool. And so basically what we're doing is they've brought over a few pencil collages that are in not good condition. Everything's really dirty, as you can imagine. It's dirty beyond belief. Cleaning is so rewarding in my field because it's just, low-hanging fruit. You clean things, they look better, and people see color and texture in a different way. So we started by cleaning, and now we're going to try to put back some pencils that have gotten loose and repair some bits of paint that are flaking, etc. But when you get something like this where the pencils are missing, and there are boxes of pencils, and we could add them back in because they're there, all these questions come up. Should you do it to begin with? Should you try to find pencils that look like the ones that are missing, or just put other ones in? With these types of works that are artisanal, that is to say they're outsider artworks, you kind of bridge certain types of conservation philosophies that go between contemporary art and ethnography and architecture. And the things that you're thinking about are all part of that process. We tend to be a bit more hands-off. We're thinking in terms of focusing ourselves on stabilization rather than restoration, these are all parts of conservation. And it's just very interesting to think about it at this level, because when you're conserving works of art as part of a larger exhibit, where your vision, Kati, is the one that overrides and we're not just here as agents of Bottle Village, we're here as agents of Bottle Village and your artistic vision. It becomes an interesting question that has other meaning. So that's really pleasant. But I wanted to say something that refers to something you said in your first comments when you were talking about coming to Bottle Village for the first time and seeing how damaged it was. There's something really alluring about something that's very damaged, from our standpoint. To me, when I see something that's extremely damaged, that's not daunting, that's kind of exciting, because when something is very damaged, it's gone to the limit of where it will go, right? As opposed to, say, when you go into someone's house and something has one scratch on it, when you know that one scratch is really hard to make better, and you often don't get the whole way there, and people are unhappy. But when something has gone through catastrophic damage, especially after an earthquake or a hurricane or a fire. And our firm works on a lot of these big triage projects. You know that you're just an agent of something positive.
Yeah, I agree, and I could add this to that too. I mean, in terms of the damage and seeing Bottle Village in a damaged state, I don't know if it was luck or naivety or whatever, but when I first went, I saw all the damage, but there was so much there that was still so beautiful. Like, you could take 1 square foot out of Bottle Village just about anywhere and have a vignette. And the remarkable thing about Prisbrey's work, and probably a lot of art environments like Watts Towers, is how a small part stands in for the whole. I mean, there are compositions within compositions. And so for me, when I first went, and what sort of drew me in, I mean, to this day, I mean, I don't go as much as I used to, but whenever I do go, I still notice a detail I've never seen before. And so I was lucky in the sense that when I went, I was able to see the beauty. There was a lot of damage, but right away I saw her hand all over this, and it was just so very compelling, and absolutely.
Right, and these works that are at the intersection of building and works of art are really interesting, because you have to be able to travel through them and exist within them and have the structures be safe enough that they don't collapse on your head. But their textures and surfaces are all meaningful. When you deal with architecture as just straight architecture, sometimes surface and finish gets put by the wayside while other issues are coming up. And actually, our firm is also working on the King's Road house with Caitlin and Bob and the team, and that was something that I found really exciting when we were first talking about the project, that the concept is that we're looking at this house as a work of art, as a sculptural component as much as a building.
There was something, I think, I'm not going to remember the exact quote, but in your book you talk about damage being almost a little bit, you had a couple of really good quotes on damage, and one of them was almost like it's cyclical. Like there's, you ask a question about how much damage is necessary before repair or something along those lines.
I think that was in the end of the book where I was reflecting on
Yeah.
the current state of the world.
Yeah.
No.
And I do like the idea of what you said a minute ago of getting to where we know it's damaged, and maybe that becomes a new place for regeneration somehow. And I think there was another quote in your book about connecting damage with some form of regeneration.
Right, yeah, because the thing is, like, when we look at something, because my book is about my family and it's about my work, and this is not about my book, this is about Kati's project, but I'll just say this because it's related. When you look at something that's very damaged, or when you look at like a marble sculpture that has a big chip out of it, your eye's going to go right to that chip. The sculpture might be beautiful in every way, shape, or form, just like Bottle Village is beautiful. And the Watts Towers are beautiful, and this house is beautiful, but people tend to focus right on damage. And that's true with human beings also. You can have people that are, all of us are extremely multifaceted. We're more than one thing, but we're often just known by our worst day or our worst moment, right?
Yeah, right. It's how they remember us. So, but I was going to just touch on something about what you mentioned, and
Do you have other
do you have
questions?
another question?
No, go ahead.
Okay, when we were trying to so the earthquake happened, and suddenly, I was a child, 21, whatever, and I'm in the middle of filling out all this paperwork for the Federal Emergency Management Agency for FEMA to get all this rebuilding money, and suddenly I'm their liaison between Bottle Village and Washington and Sacramento, and I'm learning as I go. I'm just totally learning this on the fly. and filling out all this paperwork. They're the ones who said don't go back to grad school right away. They said your money's coming in 3 months. I mean, you could be the director of this. It'll be such a great feather in your cap. And we had a situation with Congress. Somebody wrote a bill against us to take our money away, and we were
Specifically?
against Bottle Village, and we were
Really?
under federal investigation. And we got investigated by the Inspector General, and he came out to Bottle Village, and he's like, why am I even here? You guys are just like this little volunteer group. He's like, it was all political.
What, oh, that's fascinating.
Yeah. Well, I was going to say, we could talk about that debacle, if you want, but I was just going to say really quickly, when we were applying for the FEMA money, FEMA said, we don't fund art, we fund the repair of structures and buildings. We don't fund the repair of art, which, I don't know if that's fully true. I mean, they probably could fund objects, but in our case, so we said, well, we're buildings. But then when we had to deal with the building code stuff, we said, we're art, and so we kind of just navigated that however we needed to. And luckily when we wrote the National Register of Historic Places nomination, Sacramento urged us to do this. They said, this is gonna help with the FEMA money, we're gonna help get this through. Here's how to write. I didn't even know what I was doing was called historic preservation there. I just loved what I was in front of. And I was willing to be there as much as possible because I thought it was so compelling. But anyway, I guess I was doing historic preservation. And they said, here's how you write this. I wrote it. Luckily in California, because of mainly a man named Seymour Rosen, who was a really good person for preserving folk art environments in the 70s, they knew what they knew what an art environment was.
Oh, really?
And Watts Towers had been landmarked in 1976, and that was only like 20 years after Rodilla left, if not, he left about 56, 58. Yeah. And Bottle Village, she stopped, our period of significance ended in 1981, so it was only 14 years after she left, and we got it on the National Register. And we got it on as an art environment, and because we were able to do that, we gave it a lot of protection. It didn't need to be 50 years old. Everybody understood how ephemeral art environments are in California, and that if you don't, they're so ephemeral. Grandma Prisbrey's making all these structures out of materials that were never meant to be building materials. And it was funny to have to straddle that line between art and architecture.
Right, and it's good that you could though, because you say, yeah, well, you said one thing, but it's the system that forces you to do that, because no one should have to find a justification for saving Bottle Village, right?
Right.
It's kind of self-explanatory.
Right.
Yeah, you both bring up really interesting points, and I was wondering, because one of the topics that the show really covers is both a material preservation and a social preservation. One of the really amazing things about Grandma Prisbrey is that during her lifetime she gave tours and it was open to the public, and she was such a presence in the space as well as constructing it and living in it. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about the relationship between social histories and how that can deal with preservation, how that can be written into National Historic Landmark status, and how that relates to the physical objects in themselves and the work that you do, and how these kind of considerations, they're both, it's important to think about them separately, but they also are inherently linked.
Definitely you. This is definitely.
Okay, so there's a lot to unpack. That's a long question. So social histories. I could talk about this in terms of historic preservation. Typically, whenever we do a National Register of Historic Places landmark application, a property needs to be eligible under one of 4 criteria. There's criterion B is it associated with significant people? Did Abraham Lincoln sleep there? Criterion C, which is design. Is it an important example of design, or is it a masterwork associated with the architects? The master architects fall under criterion C. D does it have the potential to yield information important to history or prehistory, which is typically used for archaeology, even though Seymour Rosen called Bottle Village an above-ground archaeological dig of Simi Valley, which I think is kind of amazing. But I'm saving A for last because A is social history. Is the property associated with broad patterns or events?
What would be an example of something that was obvious in that regard?
Social history. Let me think of an example. So when I landmarked the Integratron, this ufology site in the desert, I think we found that eligible under criterion A for its associations to the post-war ufology movement in Southern
I love
California.
that word. I've never heard that word.
Yeah, it's a real word. So it's pretty, and it's such a great word.
It's a great
I want to use it wherever I can. So, when I did Pioneer Town, or actually no, I think the better example will be mental physics. So I just landmarked a place in the desert called the New City of Mental Physics Historic District, and a man named Edwin John Dingle, aka Ding LeMay, started a alternative spiritual discipline in Joshua Tree in his office was in Koreatown, but he had Lloyd Wright, Frank Lloyd Wright's son. It's the largest collection of Lloyd Wright works in one place. It was
And it's
11.
at Joshua Tree?
Yes, right off Highway 62. So there was architectural significance there, but for his associations to alternative spiritual, the context of alternative spiritual disciplines in Southern California, he was early to the New Age movement, to New Thought, Theosophy, Southern California has a whole history of merging all of these things. So that would be an example of criterion A. So even if the architecture was nothing, the property had its historic integrity from the period of significance to convey as an important example of alternative spiritual disciplines in Southern California.
So do you work on any normal buildings?
Not lately. I have, and I'll be really quick because I'll get back to what you're saying. But I worked in a corporate environment for 15 years, and I did Caltrans technical reports, and I was the architectural historian for the California High-Speed Rail Authority.
Oh, wow.
So I know how to write very anonymous papers that nobody will ever read. But a lot of
These are amazing sites. These are really interesting places.
But the thing I love about Bottle Village is that every detail there seems activated. So not only is Bottle Village amazing as a whole, I feel like suddenly every little piece of mosaic looks totally amazing. Every license plate frame looks and suddenly I'm looking at random things that people chucked in the 60s, and they all look amazing.
Yeah.
And so there's sort of a connection between that and being able to look at the vernacular environment for beauty, where it could be a liquor store or something like that.
Exactly, and the thing about Bottle Village, which struck me when I was there, is that when we think about an outsider art environment made of concrete and glass and ceramic bits and whatever, you think Watts Towers. And though they are made with the same palette, they're very different.
Absolutely.
And I was so surprised by that and so delighted by that. It would be like, two artists who work in bronze, their work is going to be completely different, and this was the same kind of thing.
Absolutely. And Bottle Village has a lot of, and I'll get to your social thing in a minute, but Bottle Village has a lot of references to maternity that are very touching the more you look. There's a lot of hearts. There's a lot of references. There was a writer named Bernie Greenfield who wrote a book called Making Do or Making Art, and she has a whole section about like objects of, I forget the term, but it's something like sympathetic magic or transference. Like if you have an object that feels calming or soothing, and the theory is that she was trying to make a very she had a kind of a crazy childhood that was taken away. And then she had 6 of her 7 kids died. So she was trying to create there's a lot of references to good luck there. There's a lot of hearts. There's a lot of horseshoes. There's a lot of shrines. And then, of course, there's the dolls. So she would go to the dump, find these dolls, make little outfits for each one, display them. There was a structure we call it the Doll's House. I've heard it called the Parade of Dolls or the Home for the Little Mothers, which kind of, I don't use that latter one too much, but.
Is that building in the way back?
No, it's in the middle, and if you look at it, and I didn't realize this till we were cleaning it up, because everything was collapsed for a while. Once we knew we weren't getting the FEMA money in 1997, we started cleaning it up. But it was shaped like a heart. She could tell she was starting that sort of cleavage part of the heart, and then she just ran. She would have been totally on her neighbor's property by the time she finished the heart, so it's like the front of a heart, and it was for all her dolls. But to get to the social thing, Jeff, you know, you took her to Women's House, right? The Women's House exhibit. Yes. So Graham, there was a what? Ann Watts. So if we're sensitive to social history in women art in Southern California, Judy Chicago knew all about Grandma Prisbrey and involved her in an art installation there in the mid-70s. So that's one thing. I mean, I always knew that Bottle Village was one of the few art environments made by a female, which is true. But when you think about how much more, I feel like we've become much more sensitive to the history of women's art in the last, even more so since I started at Bottle Village. The site is exceptionally special and exceptionally significant as an example of a woman artist doing something on such a multi-decade scale for one project. So I think that where some of that social history comes in, there could be a little bit of a nexus there.
Yeah, absolutely.
I was also wondering if you could both speak a little bit about the limitations of this kind of legal designation of preservation. I think kind of from the outside and entering into this world, there was a part of me that used to think, oh, well, it's preserved, that's great, then it'll just be around forever. That's unfortunately not always the case, and there's a lot that goes into that, both with conflicts of laws, and sometimes the laws aren't strong enough, and then there's also just environmental conditions as well. Maybe we could start with Rosa.
Sure, I can speak to that not from a legal standpoint, because that seems more to do with, but I can speak to it from a materials standpoint. There's an idea that things get preserved and then that's it, and that's never it, especially when things live outside. Anything that you preserve, and this is some good little bit of advice here, anything that is preserved, any sculpture, any building, any work of art, anywhere, but especially if it's exposed to the elements, that's just the beginning. That's just to get you the baseline, and maintenance is absolutely essential. And the reverse holds true also for, say, buildings and sculpture in the public sphere, that if you install a work of art in a public arena, you have to build it properly first, install it properly, maintain it to avoid conservation. Because conservation is expensive. It's, you know, it's sort of like the art equivalent of, you know, eat well, sleep well, and get enough exercise, or have open heart surgery, you know. It's the same thing. And so what we find also, like, there are agencies that work on public art and sculpture and installations that hire conservators to look at a work that's been accepted for a commission. So an artist and their project will be accepted by, say, the city of Los Angeles to be installed. And then a conservator reviews the whole project to see, does this make sense? You know, because some things might seem like they make sense, but they don't make sense. You know, a material that doesn't work in the public sphere, a notion that you're going to have something that is going to be climbed on by people, or is not going to be lit at night, or the neighborhood, or whatever. But then there's this popular idea that you build it so you never have to maintain it, so that it's maintenance free, or that you can apply a coating to it that will protect it, and that's just magical thinking. That's not true. Everything requires maintenance, even things indoors. You know, just think about your own houses. Like your coffee table has to be dusted once in a while. The paintings on the wall are getting that same dust on them, and they're getting it on their vertical surfaces as well. And so, you know, a little. So with something like Bottle Village, when I was there and I'm looking at the environment and the needs and just the number of leaves that blow onto the property, it's an ongoing process, and that's where it becomes complicated, because a place like Bottle Village doesn't have massive resources. And so how do you get it to the baseline, and then how do you provide the ongoing upkeep that is required for it to actually live for more than just a few years? Now, the legal issues are different,
The
too.
legal issues, and just, can you repeat the question again?
Yeah, I was just asking about the limits of historic preservation. I think it's
Got it.
so incredible the work that you're
So-
doing in saving these properties in this sense, but I was just wondering.
Sure.
Oh, wait, before you get to, I just wanted to say one thing about historic preservation. Last night, randomly, we happened to be watching with our grandchildren the movie Back to the Future, that movie from the 1980s. And in that movie, there's a historic preservation lady. I don't know if any of you remember this.
What?
They're trying to preserve this clock tower,
Oh my God.
and the
I
way it
forgot all about
was.
this.
And this woman comes out asking for money in this little box, and she was like the classic stereotype of what people think preservationists are. Some old lady, out of touch with everything, you know, shaking a can in some young person's face who like couldn't have cared less.
Yeah.
And that's one of the
Yep.
problems that we deal with in the media too, where people think of preservationists as trying to kind of hold on to some old-fashioned view of things, where all it is really trying to make our world as beautiful as places that you like to visit. You know, everybody likes to go to Europe, and there's,
Yep.
you know, everybody loves Europe,
Yep.
and there's a reason. It
Yeah.
looks beautiful because it's got years of history there.
It's so funny. I totally forgot about that. But now that I vaguely remember that. But that's hilarious, and this kind of a preservation trope. But James Marston Fitch, who's kind of like the godfather of, you know, he called historic preservationists the curators of the built environment,
Right.
which I kind of like, or something along those lines. To get back to something you mentioned a moment ago about Bottle Village, I get the strong feeling, I never knew Grandma Prisbrey, I mean, I came along after she died, but I get the strong feeling that Bottle Village, the making of Bottle Village, she wasn't necessarily thinking 100 years into the future or 50 years. I think it was very much about the process of making those buildings, keeping her occupied in that moment. There was probably a lot to sublimate or to not think about. But she also loved having the people over. It was almost like a roadside attraction. So the way you would see these things off Route 66 in the old days or something like that. So the fact that so much of it was process oriented means that it was not to mention made out of bottles as opposed to concrete block, which, by the way, she did make a structure out of concrete block before she started Bottle Village. She made a structure with her husband out of concrete block down the street. I was told it featured a blood red kitchen. That's all I know.
Wow.
But she had an appendix. Either she or him had an emergency appendix operation. They sold it, and she had the trailer from before, and they ended up somehow acquiring the Cochrane Street. Not this Cochrane. Bottle Village is on a Cochrane Street too. The other Cochrane, and.
That's funny.
Yeah, and so in bottles for her it was kind of like the pencils, like the pencils were an efficiency of space, the bottles were an efficiency of cost. I mean, she went to the dump, they were readily available, she had a 48 Studebaker, she would drive there to the dump and pick through stuff back when you could do that at the dump, and made all these structures. There was an economy to what she was doing. So, but to get to the legal part really quick, in California we have something called the California Environmental Quality Act, CEQA, according, CEQA is about the environment. And when people think about the environment, they typically think of air quality or endangered species or birds, whatnot. But buildings are part of the environment. We are either next to or in buildings probably 99% of our lives. They're an undeniable part of our environment. And so, according to CEQA, if you have a significant impact on a historically significant property, that's considered a significant impact on the environment, and you got to mitigate or adjust or try to figure out your project to avoid those impacts. So getting Bottle Village listed on the National Register, which is a federal program, that makes it a historical resource for the purposes of CEQA. And that's all fine and good, but the problem is nothing anywhere, whether it's from politics, we were talking about Florida a little bit earlier, or even with CEQA, I could landmark something, but that doesn't mean it's guaranteed to stay. It just means you got to do a much more thorough environmental review and do what's called an environmental impact report before you get rid of it. Now, the flip side of this is a lot of people hate historic preservation because they say, I'll never be able to change a pipe or toilet in my house. I can't change anything, and that's false. There's so much flexibility, and we have something in the United States called the Secretary of the Interior Standards for Rehabilitation. Whether you're local, state, or federal government, everybody follows those, and they're flexible and they're basic, but they're out to protect the big ticket items of relative to character defining features of a property. So teaching people about preservation and what it really is an ongoing process.
Right, because you're right. People think they're not going to be able to do anything. Often it's only their facades that are going to be impacted.
Exteriors,
Yeah.
So sometimes it's just public facing. Like if it's a historic district, you just have to worry about the public facing, right away. I mean, it's different from city to city. I think it'd be a real problem, but funny maybe if somebody tried to put like vinyl windows on Bottle Village, but it would be strange. It might be interesting, but vinyl windows with mid-century modern preservation is the bane of everybody's existence. And stucco coating, and the guy with the commercial on radio about the potato chip, and I could the KNX tends to, it's a news somebody. I don't know, but he's a texture coat guy, and he's had commercials on the radio on KNX 1070 for years, and you could, something to do with a potato chip, but it's not, it doesn't sound good.
Potato chips, and you wouldn't break the one.
What's that?
Your house would be covered in potato chips, and you wouldn't break the one.
Oh,
It's so weird.
So weird.
Covering a house in potato chips could be an interesting art
love that
environment,
idea.
though.
Yeah.
Try that. You'll have to conserve
That
that.
would be great. Believe me,
Yeah,
I had to
that'll be
conserve
interesting.
almost the same thing here and
Yeah.
there. But,
Yeah.
Great. Well, there's been so many interesting points you brought up. I wanted to see if there's any questions, because I feel like there's many interesting people here that have unique relationships to Bottle Village, maybe learning just about it or know quite a bit. So it seems like we have a question.
The bottle part of the environment is important.
The what part?
the bottle part.
The bottle portion of the environment.
The bottle portion.
It used to be a bottle building, bottle houses, bottle architecture. Was that everywhere?
Well, from what I know, it's interesting that she did this, and it's interesting that she moved west because there are other western towns like Rhyolite. Rhyolite's the one I can think of offhand. In the 1890s and 1880s, I think you had bottles being made by then. So in some of these places farther out west where you may not have had a railroad handy yet, it became, you used whatever you can get your hands on to build. So to me, it's a very vernacular sort of Wild West vernacular to build a house out of bottles.
I think she came west, because she probably didn't.
She made, oh, and Larry, I have, I know, and I almost forgot. I have the direct connection to the bottle house. She was at Knott's Berry Farm in Ghost Town, which had a bottle house there. So Calico Ghost Town is a tourist attraction. Yermo Walter Knott, who started Knott's, worked in Calico before it became a tourist attraction. When he made more money from Knott's, he turned around and bought Calico and turned it into a tourist.
Where is Calico?
Calico is off the 15 in Yermo, a little bit above Barstow, so maybe 20 minutes. It's quite special, actually. And it was a silver mining town that has actual 1880s vernacular Wild West.
Wow.
And so at Knott's Berry Farm, for those of you who haven't been, there's a ghost town there. And some of those buildings were done by an Austrian set designer from the 40s, but others of them were actual buildings moved to Buena Park from Garden Grove and whatnot. There's a bottle house there, and we found a picture of her. For anybody who sort of grew up in Southern California, your parents or grandparents, there was a Calistoga wagon at Knott's. There's even a picture of Elvis Presley in it, where you get your picture taken in the Calistoga wagon. We found a picture of her there from June of 1953. She started Bottle Village in 1955. So we could ascertain she probably saw that bottle structure at Knott's Berry Farm.
I want to go visit all these places. I want to go to Calico. I want to go to the, what is it called? The UFO.
Integratron?
The Integratron
It's a
and the
sound
UFO,
bath. Yeah.
UFOlogy. What was it called?
Ufology.
UFOlogy.
It sounds, ufology. It sounds like it starts off like F word, like ufology, but it's just UFO. It's nothing bad. It's, the F isn't short for anything. So.
Don't forget Anton Martin's Desert Christ Park.
Yeah. Yeah. There's a lot out there.
When I one of the things, like I wasn't born in this country, and I grew up in Miami, and Miami's like not living in this country, and certainly when I grew up there, it was like that. And I remember on my first trip out west, and I read about this in my book. On my first trip out west, I was just amazed by these kinds of things where you'd see like concrete dinosaurs by the side of the road, or those Cadillacs stuck into the ground. And we went to Graceland, and places like this just fascinated me. They seemed just so supremely American, although I bet there are things like that in other places, but they seem to me quintessentially American.
Yeah, and it's almost like, I guess, every culture has their, like, sort of what they consider lowbrow. I mean, even shell-encrusted grottos were considered lowbrow to, Rococo was a derogatory term. So or these, prayer caves or retablos, I guess they're called in Mexico. Is that the cave, or that might just be the panel? I don't know, a retablo.
The retablo is the panel.
It's the panel, it's just the panel, but these things are just, I love the fact that so many of these are, like, in Grandma Prisbrey's case, she never considered herself an artist, yet clearly what she was doing was creativity on another level, and she was quite aesthetically good, like with her compositions and stuff like that.
Yeah, it also, in kind of taking these discarded materials that were surrounding her at the time that she was making it, she ended up preserving a lot of American culture from kind of what's considered like throwaway culture from the 50s and 60s that kind of end up in the environment. Is there any? Yes?
I'm just really curious about the legal part that you were talking about. Is it that it has to continue to get legal authorization? Like you have to, every 10 years or something, go back and get it authorized?
Once a property's landmarked, pretty much at any municipality I could think of, that landmark is permanent. There's a way to reverse the landmark. I mean, some properties have been delisted, but that's typically if they've had substantial damage. So once you landmark something, that's a permanent situation. And most of my work, I've worked all over the country, but most of it's been in California. And does that answer your question? Okay.
Yes, over here.
Yeah, so I think Seymour has talked to you about this a little bit, and I've been to Bottle Village, and I think if I remember correctly, the that she used, maybe there was something about it that wasn't gonna last, right? And
Yeah.
I would imagine maybe because she was a self-taught artist, that other materials were just, like the glue maybe, or something that is maybe not archival, as opposed to how the cement wasn't, okay? And so I was wondering, when you're going back and preserving, do you try to like honor the original materials, or do you just say, no, we're gonna use something that's gonna last, like if you're rebuilding the home?
Sure. Well, okay, let me get to, you don't, first of all, it would be impossible to remake the materials. You'd have to tear it down and start from scratch. So you can't do that. What you can do is work around it, improve it, maybe impregnate it with something, maybe make repairs that are different. But you see, you can't, one of the weird things about repairing something is if you have substandard material and you need to repair right next to it, you can't use something that's a lot stronger next to it because you will cause damage. So what you do is you have to work with that limitation as your baseline. But I also want to address the question you said about glues that were not archival. Most people don't use anything archival. You know, archival is a concept that has to do really with strict conservation ethics. And within the building structures, it's not archival because concrete and wood and things like that are not archival in and of themselves. And the adhesives, I think, that she used, though we haven't analyzed yet what they are, clearly not. Then they're usually one of two things. But the main answer to your question is you can't go back and fix it. You can improve it, but you can't go back and reverse it, is what I mean. And you know, I only been there once, so I didn't certainly analyze the concrete. The concrete didn't look that bad to me. And for example, Rodia's concrete at Watts Towers is pretty good. Because people tend to mix concrete properly. You know where you have problems with materials? In the early 70s and 80s, when people were using new resins and plastics, like Oldenburg making his sculptures out of plastics, the stuff that Gemini made out of plastics. I know the fabricator who made a lot of those things, and he said, yeah, we were just messing around with all the proportions of the resins to plasticizers just to see what we could get. And that's why you have works like Klaus Oldenburg's Soft Screw, where they're all falling apart, every single one of them. But typically in the building trades, people tend to follow certain rules.
And I can say that she did a 3-to-1 mix of sand and cement. She mixed it all with her hands a lot of the time. So,
Oof.
that's
Oh my
all I know
God.
about. That's all I know about that. Yes.
Are we able to visit Bottle Village?
Oh,
Yes.
Yes, I'm very excited to share that we're going to be announcing this soon. Mac Center is going to be organizing a open hours tour for Bottle
Wonderful.
Village June 1st. So
Wow.
keep an eye out for that. We'll be announcing it shortly. Kasi, would love to have your input.
Yeah. Oh, thank you. I just wanted to say I'm so happy to hear you two talk about preservation from two very different angles and expertises. Danielle, who preserves by providing a context or declaring a historical significance, and Rosa by directly engaging and intervening into the chemistry of an object or its materiality. And I think it's so amazing because Grandma Prisbrey was a preservationist herself, and she did both. She went to the dump every day and she picked up objects and she repaired them, she cleaned them, she engaged in their materialities. But also she gave them meaning and significance by providing a context. The context was the village. I also think the village was her medium. She really was a storyteller, and the village was, with all the objects, was a way of imagining people's stories or objects' stories. Why were they bought? Why were they thrown away? That's what interested her.
but also she identified with those objects, and it was a way of telling her own biography. And that she wrote a text about Bottle Village, which is also in the book that you can buy. It's halfway a making of how she did it, and it's also a guided tour and a site plan. And there's one object she called in the village. She called conversation piece, not conservation, conversation piece. And so that was a piece she found, and nobody knew what it was or what it was for, but people kept talking about it and asking about it, and there were all kinds of conversations. And so my question to you both is, because Grandma Prisbrey, being a preservationist in her own right, she worked on the village like for, I don't know, like 15 years, like between 1955 and 78 or so.
50, I think most of the structures were done from 55. Most of them were done by 66, and we were able to figure this out because if you look closely at the bases of all the amber bottles, the years are on each one. And so if you look closely, most amber bottles, so whatever structure has an amber bottle, and we actually can get the order from which she built them from front to back. And so most of the structures were done by 66, and then she worked on it till 1981 and then left.
Yeah. So I think her idea of maintaining and preserving her work was changing it all the time, like fixing something, adding something. And my question to you both as experts of preservation is there for you, or maybe that's a question that is every time different, an ideal state that should be preserved or kept in an object? Or what's your, or in an environment, or what would be your approach to keeping something alive, which would also mean that it would keep changing, or is the ideal of keeping something fixed in a certain state it was in at one point, or it is in now, or is that just a question you have to navigate every time?
You have to navigate it every time, for sure. And you navigated it by committee, you know, there's with a few different stakeholders, and you navigate it by what's actually possible and sustainable, because we may want to keep Grandma Prisbrey's village looking like the day she made it, but who's going to pay for that, you know? So the idea with that project, that Grandma, is it Prisbrey's?
Bree, like February.
All right.
There's an R in there.
Right. Would be, I would think, if it were me, to figure out everything you need to do to stabilize the structures and the materials and make sure that you don't have broken glass around, and that, you know, keep it safe, environmentally safe, and have a good plan for maintenance that is doable. The dolls and pencil things are a different story because they're made out of organic materials, and that's the thing. Anything that's made out of inorganic materials, that is, things that are not made from anything that was living once. So, for example, to give you the example of the reverse, wood, textiles, plastics, even though plastics weren't living, they come from the same carbon-based materials. They're much harder to preserve in an outdoor environment. So you have to allow for a certain degree of change. The dolls in that environment are just going to change, you know? So that's where I would suggest. I suggest you find a sustainable point of safety where people could safely move through the buildings and the materials will be preserved, and then have a good maintenance plan that is doable.
I second that. But I will say,
Yeah, what she said.
Yes, what Rosa said. So, you know, and I agree with you wholeheartedly on everything you just said, by the way. It was, I will, you know, it was hard after a while to be there and for that long and to not see it rebuilt. So that became difficult to look at for so many years, and at a certain point I had to move on, go work and do other things with life. But when I do go back there now, and I've been back here and there, periodically, it's still strikingly beautiful in a way. And one of the things it kind of reminds me of, like, I guess in gardens in England, you had ruins. There's kind of, a lot of them weren't real ruins, they were like fake ruins. But I think it's, the reality right now is, even if there was a lot of money, it may not be the right thing to wholly restore all of those buildings. For one thing, we don't have the documentation. It would just be guesswork on a lot of them. And I think Bottle Village becomes this really interesting sort of meta layer of, it's an incredible woman's art, a woman artwork, a woman-made artwork. One of the most notable of its time, one of very few art environments worldwide made by a woman, and now it has this layer of ruin on top of it. And it's complicated, it's hard, but also I will stand by the fact that even today, if you go, there is still a lot of beauty to be had. So if it can be just sort of made safe, cleaned up, maybe some of the structures could be brought back a little bit. I think even now, when people go, they find it incredibly compelling. I mean, she could have, look at it this way, even like there were 15 structures there. Let's say she just did 3 or 4. It would still be pretty amazing that it was done. And that's what's there now, so.
And it also speaks to what you said before about one piece being a microcosm for the whole.
Exactly.
So that even if you go when you go upstairs and you see the exhibit and you see what you've put out there, it really does give you the sense of it.
Yeah, and her Bottle Village is really good. You could have one small part. You don't have to have the whole thing there. That's the good news about it. The whole thing doesn't need to be there in order to be compelling. There's just a few pieces up there and they're compelling. Wait till you go on June 1st, and I hope you all do.
Any final questions? Great, well with that, thank you so much, Daniel and Rosa. It's been such a pleasure to hear you speak. And I invite everybody to go upstairs and to view Kati Hoffer and Preserve Bottle Village Committee, and also to come visit Bottle Village for the tour on June 1st. Keep your eyes out for the announcement from Mac Center. Thank you everybody for coming.
Visit the Schindler House.
Thank you. Good job. Huh? Oh, that'd be fun. You're a good writer. It'll be for the record. You're a good writer. I read your book, and I didn't do it on Audible. I read it, the whole thing last week. I took notes. I wanted to make sure I understood everything you were interested in, and what you said about damage, and some of your about concrete, how you found it beautiful. I was going to riff off that, but we changed the subject. But it was a really, really nice book.